Good morning, bonjour. Je vous remercie d'être venu aujourd'hui. My name is David Petrasic. I'm the Director Interim of the Centre for International Policy Studies, and it's our great pleasure, together with the Montreal Institute for Genocide Studies and the all-party Parliamentary Group for the Prevention of Genocide, to welcome you today to this panel on the will to intervene. We have an excellent panel. We're going to have a terrific discussion. And I won't keep you very long, only to introduce Frank Chalk, who's the director of the Montreal Institute for Genocide Studies. And he'll kick us off this morning. Once again, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Is this live? Yes. Thank you very much. And I want to thank the University of Ottawa and some of the great people who have made this event possible here this morning. And thank all of you for coming as well. I have some sad news. Some of you may have seen La Presse or the Montreal Gazette on Saturday. It carries the news that Catherine Dallaire, the mother of General Romeo Dallaire, has passed away. And General Dallaire is unable to join us this morning. I know many of you feel the way Kyle and I do. She was a very special person, and General Dallaire is mourning. He won't be able to join us today. I should add that Catherine Dallaire actually worked at Concordia University when it was still Sir George Williams University, and rose from the ranks of the cafeteria workers to become the #2 computer purchasing officer in the engineering faculty at Concordia. And she had all the drive and all the grit, which I'm sure she passed on to General Dallaire. And so it's also a great loss for Concordia, where her memory is extremely, well, I should say, revered. Our program this morning is, does everybody have a copy of the program? Did you get a copy on the way in? No. Okay. So let me just say very briefly that the first thing I'm going to do is introduce a very important member of our panel. And I'm just going to, sorry, my duties have changed in the last 5 minutes, and I need to take out another piece of paper here. I'd like to introduce, I believe, hold on, coming up. No, thank you. My copy is evaporated. Thank you very much. You've saved me from giving the wrong first name by doing that. My apologies. I'd like to introduce, after I speak, Mark Taylor from the City of Ottawa Councillor, who will bring us the Mayor's proclamation. And then Evan Solomon will be up here to chair the panel. And of course, I think you all know who our panelists are, because that's really why you're here. So let me just say a little bit by way of background and explain the context of the remarks I'm going to make in a minute. Many of you know that the Government of Canada played an enormous role in the development of the concept of the responsibility to protect and the creation of the International Commission on State Sovereignty. There was a window of opportunity which was seized and which led to the introduction of an idea which had been originated, first of all, by Francis Deng and Roberta Cohn, who looked at the notion that national sovereignty was a perfectly valuable principle and had served in one way or another for many centuries as one of the core concepts of international relations, and that as a result of the events in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda, the United Nations had demonstrated that the perfect observance of national sovereignty would lead to perfect disasters. Between Srebrenica and the slaughter of at least 500,000 Rwandans, it was clear that something had to be done to save the reputation of the United Nations and also to hark back to those principles that existed before the Cold War, oftentimes in a very utopian framework, but nevertheless, which had led to the United Nations adoption of the Genocide Convention in 1951. R2P offers a framework within which it's possible to examine whether the interests of national sovereignty outweigh the protection of civilians, very often from their own governments, when their own governments are committing crimes against humanity and slaughtering them. It's often understood as an application of the principle of never again that emerged from the Holocaust in Europe during World War II. But in fact, it's much more than that. It's the culmination of many ideas that preceded the Holocaust as well, that we can trace back in the history of the human race. The idea that civilians who are non-combatants and are devastated by rape, torture, ethnic cleansing, mass murder because of their race, nationality, religion, and ethnic origin should not suffer this persecution and devastation. Finally, produce a critical mass of ideas which led us to the idea that the Security Council of the United Nations could serve as a major force in giving its cachet, its stamp of approval, to the limited use of humanitarian intervention or military intervention or diplomatic intervention or some other forms of intervention, even including economic sanctions, prior to military intervention. In other words, a toolbox of techniques which existed across a broad spectrum could be used to protect civilians under certain circumstances. At the General Assembly in 2005 and at other times, the United Nations has gathered the force of this impulse, which is not only humanitarian, but also rooted in national interest. The national interest that many countries have, and many citizens have in those countries, of protecting themselves from the indirect consequences of mass atrocities that are preventable. I'd like to take just a few minutes now to address an article that appeared in the Toronto Globe and Mail on Saturday that dealt with the R2P, or Responsibility to Protect principle. Some of you, how many of you read Doug Saunders' piece in Saturday's Globe? Okay, well, not too many of you, so I'll very briefly, this will only take 5 minutes, recapitulate it and urge you in the discussion to recognize the nuances of the responsibility to protect. By the way, the condensed report is extremely brief and very well outlined in the original International Commission on State Sovereignty report. So Doug Saunders devoted his column to the responsibility to protect, focusing on the failure of the international community to halt the slaughter in Syria under the responsibility to protect doctrine. While recognizing that the Syrian situation is potentially explosive because Russia is an ally of Syria and Iran is backing Syria's Bashar al-Assad, Doug pointed to India, South Africa, and Brazil as countries really calling the shots on Syria, and noted their buyer's remorse following the military campaign in Libya. He fears that these countries will succeed in making sovereign national borders sacred again. I am particularly struck by Doug's assertion, with which I seriously disagree, that if the UN or NATO or other countries, or maybe regional organizations, fail to intervene militarily in Syria, the responsibility to protect doctrine must be seen as falling apart. I'm also a bit surprised by the way Doug formulates the issue when he declares that this may be the end of the era when we can easily invade a country to protect its people. As Ambassador Heinbecker knows, David Kilgour and Errol Mendez know, it was never easy to do that. And that phrase really, I think, undermines his argument. I would just like to take a few minutes to remind Doug and anyone who agrees with him, that the authors of the Responsibility to Protect report anticipated events like Syria and laid out clear guidelines to ensure that military intervention was not chosen as an easy solution. And they had good reasons for doing so. Let me recall their argument briefly and urge that we consider this morning the wisdom that lies at the heart of their concern. The R2P report set out 6 criteria for military intervention for human protection purposes, and that comes at the end of a whole series of prior actions that are non-military. The 6 causes, or the 6 criteria, I should say, for military intervention are right authority, just cause, right intention, last resort, proportional means, and reasonable prospects of success when you intervene. I believe it is reasonable prospects of success that Doug Saunders neglects at his peril and ours. Drawing on the wisdom acquired from the history of earlier interventions for humanitarian and other purposes, the International Commission on State Sovereignty laid down as a cardinal principle that military action can only be justified if it stands a reasonable chance of success, that is, halting or reverting the atrocities or suffering that triggered the intervention in the first place. In other words, military intervention is not justified if actual protection cannot be achieved, or if the consequences of embarking upon the intervention are likely to be worse than if there is no action at all. The Commission applied its own version of the Hippocratic Oath sworn by physicians when it declares, in particular, a military action for limited human protection purposes cannot be justified if in the process it triggers a larger conflict. It will be the case that some human beings simply cannot be rescued except at unacceptable cost, perhaps of a larger regional conflagration involving major military powers. In such cases, however painful the reality, coercive military action is no longer justified. I have a longer argument about this because I had to precede it with that very insufficient skimming of R2P. Let me just go to the final paragraph. The Commission admits that its caveats raise the issue of double standards, but its position is simply this: the reality that interventions may not be able to be mounted in every case where there is justification for doing so is no reason for them not to be mounted in other cases. In other words, intervention may well be undertaken in other cases where the remaining 5 criteria are satisfied and no major power stands in the way, especially a nuclear power. So, in our discussion this morning, I hope my reminder is constructive and useful. I would like to do something about Syria. I have a lot of ideas about things we can do, and I'm not the only one. Many people do, short of military intervention at this stage. But one last sentence. Bashar al-Assad should remember that if he exacts an even greater blood tax than at present from the people who oppose his regime, the time may come when the risk of civilian casualties and a regional conflict resulting from an international military intervention will not overbalance the number of lives that can be saved through armed intervention. And in that case, under all 6 R2P principles for military intervention, I'm sure that some people will come knocking on our door. And I hope that this time will answer. Thank you very much. And now, I'd like Councillor Taylor. Welcome, Councillor Taylor, and thank you for joining us here today. Mike.
Thank you very much, and everybody at the mic is getting successively shorter. I don't know if that bodes well for you for the end of the day. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, distinguished panel guests, for coming and participating in this today. I'm here on behalf of the Mayor of our city, Jim Watson, and my council colleagues this morning, and I am pleased to come and bring greetings on their behalf. We are fortunate in Canada to be a place of peace, of prosperity, of acceptance, and of mutual respect. Canada has a long history of being committed to human rights, and we thank General Dallaire, who of course we're all saddened to hear about his mother's passing, for all of the work he has done on creating the Will to Intervene project. As Canada's capital city, Ottawa is host to many human rights organizations, and we are home to many thousands of immigrant families from all over the world. And in fact, my own ward is probably one of the most diverse wards in our entire city. Citizens of Ottawa and Canada are citizens of the world. We need only to look back to the 2009 Tamil diaspora protest to remember how quickly the wars and atrocities of other countries can come to our doorstep. And so today, the City of Ottawa joins Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto in declaring our support for the Will to Intervene project. Only when people have the courage to speak out for the human rights of others and apply strong pressures to governments that do not protect their citizens' rights will we prevent mass atrocities and genocide. The citizens of Ottawa are proud to stand up and be counted as staunch supporters of peace and of human rights and the protection of life. And it is in that spirit this morning that I will read to you a proclamation from our council and from our mayor that we will be presenting to you this morning. It is titled Will to Intervene Day, September 24th, 2012. Whereas mass atrocities such as genocide, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing offend the conscience of humankind, and whereas mass atrocities often create conditions that produce concrete threats from terrorism, piracy, and other forms of lawlessness on the land and the sea, and whereas mobilizing the domestic will to intervene as espoused by the all-party parliamentary group for the prevention of genocide and other crimes against humanity is an essential prelude to mounting the international cooperation necessary for preventing mass atrocities. Therefore, I, Jim Watson, Mayor of the City of Ottawa, do hereby proclaim September 24, 2012, Will to Intervene Day in the City of Ottawa, our nation's capital. And I'd like to invite Kyle Matthews up just to take the proclamation this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish you, I think you're off to a thought-provoking start, and I wish you a very fruitful discussion today, and thank you again for being part of this very important endeavor.
Thank you again. Okay, I'm going to welcome now Evan Solomon. Would you like to sit here? I'll sit over here. Sure. He might work better for you. Thank you, Dennis. I think I shall at this time.
Thank you, everyone. This is probably, my name is Kyle Matthews. I'm the Senior Deputy Director for the Will to Intervene project. This is the main heart of our discussion today, to bring together a various group of people with different expertise to talk about the challenges of preventing and interdicting mass atrocity crimes and Canada's role in that. We're very lucky today to have the chair of Evan Solomon, one of Canada's best-known journalists. He's the host of Power and Politics. It's wonderful to have him here today. And we also have Ambassador Paul Heinbecker, our former Canadian ambassador to the UN, and also a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation. We have Errol Mendez, a professor of law here at Ottawa U, who's a frequent commentator on human rights and international affairs. He writes for the Huffington Post. Another great person to have. And ending it off, we have David Kilgour, who is a long-time serving member of Parliament. He formerly served for the Conservative Party and then for the Liberal Party, and he was nominated at one point for the Nobel Peace Prize. He also brings a parliamentarian and an activist side to human rights. So with further ado, I'm going to leave it to Evan. We're going to have about a 45-minute discussion, and then we're going to turn to the to you to have a live question and answer period with the audience. Thank you. Over to you, Evan.
Thanks, Kyle. Very interesting day. Monday, the 24th of September, we'll intervene day to have this discussion. So let's try to have a lively discussion. We'll have about 40 minutes here with the panel, and then if you have questions, there's microphones, and we'll try to get to them. And I recognize these discussions are always very wide-ranging, obviously fraught with both a political and emotional side, and we'll try to engage in as fruitful a discussion as we can. I think I'll start Mr. Kilgour, because I think you want to make an opening statement. Yeah, go for it.
Chers amis, comme vous, je donne mes condoléances les plus profondes à Romeo Dallaire à cause de sa mère. Je sais très bien que la plupart de vous sont venus pour voir M. Dallaire, mais en tout cas, I hope nobody's got up to leave. I'm happy to. I'm sure Mr. Dallaire, I think, is our greatest national hero. Certainly one of them would be thankful for that. I'll be brief. There's a longer version of what I was going to say at the back if anybody wants it. It's, as we heard from Frank, the UN Genocide Convention of 48 criminalizes in 142 participating countries acts intended to, quote, destroy in whole or in part members of a racial, national, religious, or ethnic group. Unfortunately, there were no prosecutions launched under that convention for 6 decades. Enforcement, therefore, remains a major weakness. The International Court of Justice dealt it a further blow in 2007 by holding that the genocide in Serbia, the government of Serbia, was not responsible for what happened in it. The UN Security Council and the larger international community must find a way, I'm sure we all agree, to prevent outdated notions of national sovereignty from allowing genocides and mass atrocities to occur. Consider here some of the events in a long range of countries, going back to Leopold's Congo, Ukraine's famine, of course the Holocaust, Chiang Kai-shek's Taiwan, Mao's Tibet, Pol Pot's Cambodia, the Ndebele people in Mugabe's Zimbabwe, Bosnia, Bashir's Darfur, the Nuba Mountains, and I would argue Sri Lanka should be in that list too, and Falun Gong in China. One of the Canada's most revered heroes, as I mentioned, Senator Dallaire, was going to speak today about Rwanda. Let me just add a couple of things. The slaughter ended there when Paul Kagame and his soldiers took Kigali and formed a new government without international or UN help. The performance of the UN during the genocide was unforgivable to the Rwandan people. It shocked those of us who thought that the UN was supposed to represent all peoples equally. As Senator Dallaire put it, quote, are some more human than others? Shake Hands with the Devil, published in 2003. How many of you have read it? I'm really curious about it. Oh, wonderful. Well, I'm sure you'd all agree that it should be compulsory reading for everyone, and particularly those dealing with the ongoing Darfur and Nuba Mountain crises that are continuing. Darfur is aptly termed Rwanda in slow motion. Some points made by Norman Epstein of the Canadians Against Slavery and Torture in Sudan 3 years ago seem to be basically equally applicable today. I'll just give a couple. The statistics include about 400,000 people murdered. Not only death by violence, but famine and disease. Some 2.5 million people have been forcibly displaced from their homes. He asks, what can Canada do now? He says we can urge our international partners to stop negotiating with Khartoum. In the words of Elie Wiesel, quote, we must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented. A word about the Nuba Mountains, Blue Nile. I hope you're familiar with that. Since South Sudan celebrated its independence in July, the Bashir regime has waged war against the residents. The bombing campaigns appear designed to terrorize the Nubians, who number about 1 million, into fleeing into South Sudan. Hassan Sharif of Kitchener, who's the chair of the Nuba Mountains Association, says, "The air bombings by North Sudan's governments are race-based. These civilians are seen as black Africans by the Bashir regime, which respects only those it considers Arabs. Humanitarian aid is not reaching residents," and so on. A word about Democratic Republic of Congo. In 2009, the Canadian All-Party Parliamentary Group for Genocide Prevention, I see Paul Dewar, who was the chair, just came in, released its report on the humanitarian crisis in the DRC. I think this is you, Paul, I'm quoting. "Millions of lives have been lost, communities have been destroyed, and civilians, particularly women, have carried the weight of the ongoing armed conflict in the DRC. There's a long list of recommendations that Paul's committee has given. I'll just give a couple. D'élaborer un plan national pour appliquer les résolutions 1325 et 1820 du Conseil de sécurité, and there's several others, 5 others given. Let me quote, I'm sure everyone has a cell phone here today. Let me quote Jean Bertin, a Congolese who wants to end the absolute silence around crimes committed in his country, where, as you know, the exploitation of raw materials like coltan continues. This is his quote. "It's possible that 2 children died so that you could have that mobile phone," close quote. Very brief word about China. Since 2001, the party state across China has been pillaging vital organs on a large scale for members of the Falun Gong spiritual exercise community, murdering them in the process and selling their organs for large sums to Chinese nationals and to organ tourists from around the world. A related part of this inhuman commerce is a network of forced labor camps where Falun Gong and other prisoners make a range of consumer products for export. And I suspect some of us are probably wearing products that were made in those camps. Iran, finally. In recent letters to the UN Secretary General and Secretary of State Clinton, MP Erwin Kotler, co-chair of the Interparliamentary Group for Human Rights in Iran, said, and I quote, "Allowing President Ahmadinejad to address the UN General Assembly," it's this week, I believe, "is a cruel parody of law and justice. A person who pursues the most destructive of weaponry in violation of the UN Security Council resolution, who incites to genocide, who is complicit in crimes against humanity, who's engaged in a massive repression of human rights of his own citizens, such a person should be the object of an indictment of this international body rather than a beneficiary of its respective podium." Kotler added, "There are precedents in international law and U.S. conduct that would exclude war criminals such as Ahmadinejad from entering the U.S., let alone addressing the UN. My conclusion, responsibility to protect doctrine arose, as we heard, from a Canada-funded International Commission on State Sovereignty and Intervention. We had won the election for the Security Council in '98, partly on a platform of protection for civilians, persuaded by things that General Dallaire had said. When Serbia's Milosevic attacked the Albanian population in the province of Kosovo, world opinion seemed to tip in favor of an effective mechanism to protect civilians who were taxed by their own government. In 2005, the R2P doctrine was endorsed by a UN summit, as I'm sure you all know. Last year, it was put into practice when the Security Council decided to create a no-fly zone in Libya after Gaddafi threatened a massive attack on the opposition-held city of Benghazi. The initiative was propelled by Gaddafi's language that he planned to cleanse Libya home by home. Words similar to those used by the genocidaires in Rwanda. If a regime expresses clear genocidal or systematic atrocity intentions, R2P now allows other governments to prevent him from killing his own people. Tragically, R2P, as Frank said, does not yet apply to countries such as Syria, protected by governments, 2 in particular, having vetoes in the Security Council. So I would end by putting this out to you that Canadians should actively, all of us, promote the R2P doctrine. It offers the best hope for achieving the never again pledges that followed the '94 genocide in Rwanda by allowing the UN and international community to shift the focus from governments intervening for humanitarian purposes to the civilians in need of protection. In the past, our intervention usually arrived too late to save lives. R2P allows governments to act before a tyrant begins to slaughter its citizens. Contrary to the notion that R2P is part of a north-driven agenda, other countries supporting it include Argentina, Armenia, Bosnia, Chile, Croatia, East Timor, El Salvador, Nepal, Peru, Rwanda, of course, Sierra Leone, and Uruguay. In short, what we're doing today is useful and important, but all of us should be, going forward, should be doing whatever we each can to energize R2P internationally for the sake of the one human family. Thank you. Merci.
Thanks, David. David, thanks for that, and a very good outline. So what will happen over the next couple of minutes is, I'll just give you a shape of it. David's given us an overview. I think Frank gave us a good overview as well. And then I want to talk about the relevance of R2P, the challenge that Syria has posed to its relevance in the world, and its ongoing usage. And that will swing us a bit to Paul's wheelhouse, which is the United Nations, and I think David just talked about that in terms of Iran. The challenge it poses to the relevance of that, and is it a body that can execute these kind of ideas through R2P. Then we'll talk about some of the current situations, and David outlined them, you know, whether it's DRC, Libya, Syria, Mali, Iran. I mean, there's a long list of tragic situations, and we have to, the list is important, not only because you can't morally measure one tragedy against another, but there is a triage that the world goes through, and then you have to decide how do you actually intervene in the bodies, the politics of that, where, when, and in what situations, why one and not another. And then at the end, we'll try to swing it to Canada's foreign policy. What role does Canada play? Is Canada a leader in this? Has Canada's foreign policy changed with regards to this? Are we moving away from some structures and into other structures? What I mean by that is whether it's UN-led missions or NATO-led missions, and what function they have, whether they're, you know, the Libya side, whether they actually need boots on the ground, and what are the ongoing, I think the word responsibility is absolutely crucial. What are the responsibilities ongoing after the initial act to protect? So there's a couple of stages that Frank outlined. First, the act to protect, and then you've got ongoing issues in wherever you are. So with those in mind, let's start at the beginning with the R2P. And I'll start with Paul Heinbecker. And I think we can just sit here and have this discussion. I hope everyone can see at the back. If you can't, I would just innovate and stand up. But Paul, is R2P an important document in the current situation posed by Syria? How fragile is the very legitimacy of R2P, and does the structure currently at the UN undermine our hopes that R2P can be a legitimate tool to intervene? Yes. In 2 seconds.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me in the back of the room? You can hear me? Because I don't have a strong voice and I don't speak loud. I listened to Frank's defense of R2P, and I listened to and his depiction of Doug Saunders' story. I don't know how I missed it, but I guess somehow I did. I fear you're both right. R2P certainly foresees, with its precautionary principles, that it's not to be evoked in every crisis. There's no question about that. You wouldn't have precautionary principles if it was to be imposed, especially the military dimension of it, was supposed to be imposed at will, so to speak. The difficulty with R2P has been something that Louise Frechette pointed out to me way back when I handed over the report on R2P to the Secretary General of the UN in the year 2000. And that is that the problem is not going to be too much intervention, the problem is going to be too little intervention. And we tend to get a little confused. We've just had a very successful, and I'm prepared to say that again, a very successful intervention in Libya. But I think Doug is right in saying that countries like India, like Brazil, and like the others, in their efforts to kind of roll things back, they may not call it that, but that's what's going on. These are the countries that did not, first of all, they claim to have a right to a permanent seat on the Security Council, with or without vetoes, I'm not sure, but they're claiming that India, Brazil, Germany, among others, they're the countries that were not prepared to endorse the responsibility to protect being invoked in Libya. And they're the ones who are now saying, but you have a responsibility while protecting. It is difficult enough to get intervention without tangling it up with other responsibilities that go with it. Obviously, you have a responsibility to while you're protecting. There were, by one count at least that I've heard, 150 civilian casualties caused by NATO. That's 150 in 6 months. You have that in about an hour in Syria every day. So I fear that there is an attempt by countries like the Brazilians, like others, to roll this concept back. I think Doug is probably right in that. The interesting thing that happened when there was a General Assembly resolution, because the Security Council was not prepared to deal with it because of the Russian veto. The General Assembly resolution, the countries that voted for it included Libya, Tunisia, and Egypt. And I can tell you from personal experience that in the old days, prior to the Arab awakening, they would have been on the other side of that argument. So time is shifting in the direction of countries being willing to intervene. And in my own judgment, as far as Syria is concerned, there would have been an intervention already, probably, had there not been an American election. The fundamental driver in this is that Obama has running on a campaign of bringing the boys and girls home from Iraq, from Afghanistan. The American people are fed up, and I don't think that they would be willing to entertain the idea, and from a presidential candidate, that he would be starting another war. Mr. Romney may have the pleasure of defending that position, but that's not what Obama is going to do. But that means, that you have to, if you're a foreign country, you have to pay close attention to the American political calendar about when you launch your rebellion if you expect to get any help.
The real politic, if there was one. Now, Errol, I want to continue on with this discussion about the legitimacy, the viability of R2P, and what role it plays now in the. We're talking about it. We always. If Romeo Dallaire was here, obviously we talk about it in the sense of Rwanda and the lessons, but there's a new political lens. We're looking through the Libya-Syria nexus now, and the role that plays. Tell me your views on where that functions and how the UN helps or hurts our implementation of it now.
Thanks, Evan. And first of all, again, my thanks to the organisers, and again, my regret that our great Canadian John Dallaire is not here. But I wanted to delve a little bit into the details of the Libyan intervention and the reason why there is now a failure to react in Syria. One of the things, if you delve, and I'm writing a book on some of the details of the Libyan intervention, one of the details which I think you should focus on is the role of regional organizations. They were absolutely critical in getting the Security Council to finally agree to intervene. And the list was stunning in terms of what Paul just mentioned. The people who you would think would be against R2P suddenly was swinging around the intervention. And let me give you the list. The African Union, the Arab League, the Gulf Cooperation Council of the Gulf States. The most interesting one was the Organization of Islamic Conference, which is most of the Muslim states in the world. They all swung behind the intervention, which eventually led China and Russia to bite their tongues and agree to both resolutions. Resolution 1970, which initially threatened Gaddafi with sanctions, and then when he failed to observe it, then Resolution 1973, which then led to the intervention, taking all the necessary means to protect civilians. Now, what that tells me is that if the situation is correct, the force that can be gathered around regions, the regional organizations, can counter the weight of Russia and China. And that is something Canada should be very much focused on, is how can we engage with some of the regional organizations around the world to actually help them deal with potential mass atrocity occurrences. And there's ones happening right now around the world which we haven't even heard about. There's a potential war, which could be a really massive mass atrocity if it ever occurred between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh. Likewise in Mali. There are many other areas of the world where we are not paying enough attention to, which could then trigger a mass atrocity. So, when Russia and China did not get their way in Libya, we come to Syria. And I agree completely with Paul that Syria has to be looked at in its detail. And there's an old saying in law school, hard cases make bad law. It's a very hard case because there's a proxy war chess game going on at 3 levels with Syria. Firstly, there's a war going on obviously between the rebels, the various factions of rebels, and the Assad regime, which is basically being supported by his own community, the Alawite community, and some of the other communities who feel they have been protected by Assad. That's one of the wars going on. There's another proxy war going on between the Sunni world and the Shia world, which is actually now actively engaged in the crisis in Syria. And finally, there's an even bigger proxy war going on between Russia, China, and the West. You see that in many areas, parts of the United Nations, and you see that in Security Council. You see that, for example, with Russia now openly saying that it is not going to follow the democratic traditions that happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall. They've recently said that they will regard any foreign organizations in Russia, which is funded by the US or others, as potentially committing treason. So when you have all that occurring, you have 3 massive proxy wars going on, and one has to understand that in the context, responsibility to protect. So for Saunders to ignore all those details, I think he shouldn't even think about writing what he did without understanding all those details. Having said that, in the discussion that follows, and I won't take up much of the time, I think even countries like Canada, like the United States and others, have a grave omission to answer for. And that is a lack of focus, not on the responsibility to react, which is to intervene, but the responsibility to prevent, which is the most fundamental aspect of responsibility to protect. I just want to finish off to quote you from one of the heroes of the human rights movement who recently died, Alison Deforge of Human Rights Watch, who gave this chilling account of the ample warning that the world had pending the genocide in Rwanda. I'll just quote to you as a statement. A January 11, 1994 telegram from General Romeo Dallaire, commander of the UN peacekeeping force, to his superiors, was only one of the most famous warnings of mass slaughter being prepared in Rwanda. From November 1993 to April 1994, there were dozens of other signals. Foreign observers did not track every indicator, but representatives of Belgium, France, the United States were extremely well informed about the coming slaughter. In January, and this is the most amazing part, in January, an analyst at the US Central Intelligence Agency knew enough to predict, and this is the horrible part, predict as many as 500,000 persons might die in case of renewed conflict. They were predicting the number. So that's something which I would like you to think about in terms of where can Canada come into this. Maybe we can't deal, if the proxy wars are going on such a level, maybe we don't have the ability to intervene as much as we can. But we certainly can intervene in that very first, and in my view, the most important part of responsibility to protect, and that is the responsibility to prevent.
You raised some good points, but I complicated ones. I want the rest of the panel, I want that panel to pick up on that. If hard cases make bad law, and we know that saying, the problem is most cases that require R2P and genocide are hard cases. Now there's some less hard than others and on the spectrum, but none of them are easy cases. And we also know that there's always underlying issues, whether they're environmental scarcity issues, tribal issues, proxy war issues. There's always factors that determine these kind of conflicts. When it comes to the political decision for governments to say we want to utilize R2P, not only because it fits the criteria, but because we're prepared to sell it to our people, right? And whatever length of time this requires. How do you then delineate between a Libya and a Syria, a DRC, you talk about prevent, and a Mali, what's going on, David?
Well, I have to confess that I was the, may I say, idiot who opened the Tripoli office for Canada in January 2002 for the government of Canada. And Gaddafi's son came to the event, ladies and gentlemen, and he couldn't have been, you know, Islam, Islam, he couldn't have been more democratic and more human rights and more wanted to do business in Canada. And of course, we all saw what happened there. But anyway, I've done enough talking already.
No, David, I mean, this is not, I mean, why don't you just pick up on that? It's complicated, and these actors are playing double games, triple games. How do we then, is there a way to delineate, and for people to understand, if R2P is to be useful, how Libya and not Syria? Yeah, okay.
Well,
okay, David.
Well, I agree with what's been said about Syria. In fact, the Russian rep at the UN is Mr. Churkin, and I'm sure you know him, Paul.
Indeed I do.
And I went to see him about Iran, actually, not too long ago. And you know what he did? He wanted to talk only about what you said about how many people died in Libya. That was the only subject he wanted to talk about. So I think we have to be careful about not falling into the kind of mindset that people like Churkin have. We have to, I think we all have to represent universal values, and every human being is important, and whether it's a child, we have to stand up for people, and we have to somehow get through the nonsense that we hear from people like Mr. Churkin.
Paul, pick up on that. I appreciate that, but foreign policy, when governments make decisions, it is not simply on that moral criteria as much as you may wish or want. There's so many other factors, as you know well. How do you make these decisions without undermining the very legitimacy of R2P?
Well, issues like this usually boil down to whether you want to or not. People who want to intervene will find the reasons for intervening, and people who don't want to intervene will find the reasons for not intervening. We didn't intervene in Bosnia because you know, we were hearing from the British that there were it took 270,000 German soldiers in the Second World War to hold down the Serbs and the Yugoslav forces, and there was no prospect of that. And you know, we heard excuse after excuse after excuse. But the reality is they didn't want to. When the international community changed its mind and decided it wanted to, all of that was swept away. And all of it was found basically to be fictitious as well. That's one case. Insofar as Libya is concerned, Libya actually, I'm not sure who said it, you said, I think it was, none of these are easy. Libya was actually easy. In military terms, no one suffered a scratch on the NATO side. And I think there's something to be, there's a parenthesis we should open up here, and that is with modern technology, so long as some people have it and others don't, intervention is actually getting easier and easier. You're not even putting pilots at risk anymore. You're taking out air defenses, you're knocking down aircraft, you're doing air-to-ground attacks, and all of that's being sort of run from Arizona or someplace like that. So the idea that it's very difficult and costly depends. Libya was, you know, everybody lived within about 150 yards of the Mediterranean along the entire coast. You had NATO with bases right, you know, sitting right across the water. There was nothing to it from a military perspective. I'm exaggerating a bit. And by the way, just to fill in a parenthesis, a second parenthesis, I would have been very comfortable arguing the intervention in the UN Security Council. It would not have troubled me at all. I think a lot of the upset that you're seeing is feigned, especially on the part of the Russians. The resolution said very clearly that there would be a no-fly zone, and the member countries were authorized to use all necessary means to implement the decision to have a no-fly zone and all necessary means to protect civilians. And all necessary means including knocking down defenses so that you're not sending your aircraft up, you're not required to commit suicide when you're doing responsibility to intervene or to protect. So the people who took the view that they weren't expecting this military response were being, at best, extremely naive, but more likely quite dishonest. And I include the Russians and the Chinese and the Brazilians and the Indians and the Germans as well, if anybody wants. But the question was Libya versus Syria. Well, Syria is a lot more complicated, as Errol was saying. Governments do have to take into account. Think of it, let's just take a quick survey. Turkey is a country that's most engaged. Turkey has a Kurdish population. That Kurdish population is now seeing an opportunity to work with the Syrian Kurds to destabilize and to try to get some kind of autonomy or autonomous region or independence for Kurds in Turkey. So the Turks have to think to themselves, gee, this is pretty complicated. We've seen more reports about the use of chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction. And which country could those weapons actually reach? Well, it turns out to be Turkey. So if you're living in Ankara or Istanbul or Izmir or someplace and you're saying to yourself, you know, we should be gung-ho, we should intervene, you've got to think about what the consequences are going to be. And the Turks look around and they say, who is with us? Well, actually, nobody is with us. The West has wrung its hands raw but has done nothing, except for, you know, a little. In the American case, they say some non-lethal equipment and CIA training. So then you look at Lebanon. Lebanon has just had 18 years of civil war and is desperate not to have another one. The Israelis are you know, going around the circle. The Israelis are saying to themselves, what does this mean for us? By the way, we want to attack Iran. What is this? Syrian stuff is very inconvenient for us right now. Let us attack Iran and then we'll get back to the Syrian problem later. Iraq is not settled yet, and it's run by Shiites who are sympathetic to it. So how are you going to close off this supply of arms from Iran, also Shiite, to Syria? Then you get the Russians, who don't believe. I think one of the things it boils down to is who believes that is what you philosophically believe about the state. Does the state serve the population, serve and protect the people, or do the people serve and protect the state? For those who think that the state is there to protect the people, you have to be in favor of some kind of an intervention. For those who think that this people exist to protect the state, like Russia, I would argue, then they don't basically care how many people have to be sacrificed in order to preserve the thing. Plus, they have a base at I think it's called Taras. Plus, they're selling arms. Plus, it's the last client they have in the Middle East. Okay, but all of that is very complicated. But and then you have, you know, it's not the one indispensable country anymore. But in this particular case, it's pretty necessary. And that's the United States. The United States is in the middle of an election campaign and is not going to do anything about it. So when you compare Libya and Syria, you can find a lot of reasons for not doing it. The reasons for doing it are 30,000 people dead this morning. And by next week, there's going to probably be, or in 2 weeks, there's going to be 35,000 dead. And that's going to keep on happening until the world finally gets fed up with it, or until the fight ends. And I don't think that we can see an end to this fight in Syria. So on the fundamental issue of should we be intervening or not, you know, you can't look. I admit that I'm of more than one mind of this. I reluctantly admit that. But you know, one film by some provocateur in the United States about the Prophet, and you've got half the Islamic world in riots. How much trouble would an invasion of Syria cause?
Errol, pick up on. I think that the tough question is not to explain the reasons why Syria is difficult to intervene and the thorny issues. the tougher question from our perspective today is, how do we champion responsibility to protect if in the fine print it is responsibility to protect as long as we can do it easily? If that's the perception, then the will to do it becomes, and the litmus test becomes, I mean, I recognize that's actually what it is, not easy, but you know, there's an element there. But what does that tell us about the moral imperative of responsibility to protect and how that may be driving its importance?
Well, starting with the moral imperative, I think the moral imperative is one which Frank started the discussion with, and that is in terms of the promise after the Second World War of never again, in terms of mass atrocities amounting to genocide. It's not only a moral imperative that the world promised, it's a legal imperative. And I slightly disagree with David in terms of the ICJ decision in the Serbia decision. While they did not give responsibility directly to Serbia, they did, however, say that Serbia had a duty, was culpable in not preventing it. And one of the things I think at least the international legal community around the world has to do is to promote this idea that there is a binding international legal duty to prevent genocide whenever and wherever the international community can. That will at least be, if you like, some good coming out of the Syria debate if we can promote that. Secondly, however, I think that the core of responsibility to protect, which is often forgotten and has been mentioned already again, is this notion of proportionality. Proportionality has to be met if anyone is contemplating intervening in any way, shape, or form. And part of that critical aspect of proportionality is you do not make the situation worse by intervening than if you did not intervene. And as Paul and I have said, there is a possibility that you could have a regional and possibly even an international meltdown if the wrong type of intervention happened with Syria. However, I'm one of those people who thinks there should be a form of military intervention, at least after October, at least after November the 6th, the 7th. And that is a commitment by those states who have the ability to do that, is to enforce a no-fly zone. At least that would actually help the situation reach a possible climax with either a stalemate happening between Assad, which he has to then agree to some form of political compromise, or the rebels win. But I think at minimum, after the after the November elections, the United States, who has the ability either through actual aircraft or through drones, as Paul has said, could easily enforce a no-fly zone after the November elections. I agree with him that nothing's going to happen before then.
Evan, I agree with Errol on that. How would the people in the room feel about that? How many of our people here today would favor some kind of an intervention from the air, presumably, in Syria after the American election? Can I ask you to raise your hand?
Just raise your hand if you favor an intervention. About half. About half. We're going to get to questions in a minute, but here we are. Look at the amount of complexity. Here we have what roundly is considered a very successful intervention in Libya. I mean, there's lots of issues with it, but I think Paul said it. Many people who on the side of R2P defend the Libyan intervention. So here you have a big, big win in the one ledger. Then Syria comes along and throws us into a real crisis on how the world acts. And we're completely succumbing to the complexities there for obvious reasons. Meantime, Sudan, Darfur, David talked about that, continues to burn. And that North Mali, DRC, I mean, we could go through the world. And then it raises the question, we got through Libya. It didn't give us a mandate to start using R2P, a kind of consensus at all. In fact, some would say because Russia and China's reaction, R2P has been set back by Libya and intervention. How then do we move from the Libya-Syria crisis that we're dealing with now, and keeping it in mind, maybe this takes the negative capability of the world, and then how then do we say, all right, government, and we'll get to Canada in a minute, the indispensable governments, we need action with Sudan right now. You've got to do something about the Darfur situation. How then do we deal with all these situations, or inevitably do we have to succumb to the notion that we have to pick a battle and then let the others suffer? How do we deal with that, the amount of tragedies that we report?
I don't think we can do anything other than the second. I don't think, you know, I don't think the population of any country, including Canada, who might be candidate for these kinds of interventions, is prepared to have an open-ended commitment to go to war on an elective basis. I just don't think it exists. I think a responsibility to protect is useful in giving you a framework and a talking point vis-a-vis others. But it doesn't, in signing on to that, I don't think any of those governments were signing on to the idea that they were going to intervene with their soldiers, putting their people at risk, and taking the consequences of that on an open-ended basis. It's too bad. Let's just, two divergent comments. I have to remind myself there's two, because I'm going to forget the second one. The first is on, you know, the issue of the veto of Russia and China. It's interesting when you were talking. Who was talking about Churkin? You raised Churkin's name. Churkin used to be the ambassador in Ottawa, and I actually had lunch with him to talk to him about Kosovo. And I told him that Russia had a veto over a UN-mandated intervention in Kosovo, but it didn't have a veto over military intervention in Kosovo, just a UN-mandated intervention in Kosovo, and that sooner or later, and sooner in my judgment, and it turned out to be right, there was going to be an intervention in Kosovo, and it was going to override the Russian veto, and that was going to, and they could protest all they wanted. That's what I mean when I say it comes down to whether you want to or not, because there's a difference between this document, the responsibility to protect, and what was actually approved at the UN in 2005. And that is, this one foresees that if you can't get the UN to act, you go around it. This, obviously, if it's approved by the UN, doesn't. So there is no way, let's put it another way, there is nothing stopping the world from intervening except its self-determined capacity to do so. But that is not inconsequential as a factor. People, we are not, you know, you could talk about the Congo, you can talk about Sudan, you can talk about Somalia, you can talk about Sri Lanka, and the more you talk about all of them, the less likely it's going to be that you're going to get an intervention in any of them. And now I've forgotten my second.
Well, come back to it, but I want to, because we're closing, I want to get some questions in, but let's sort of point towards practical applications. The scope of the problem is difficult, and we've outlined it. And each particular situation we could march through and have days and days debate on. But then when we come to our government, if indeed we can't do everything, if indeed we won't do everything, what can we do and what ought we do? Errol, I'll start with you because you mentioned engaging regional actors and regional organizations, which I think is absolutely critical, because outside of the Libya operation, which I think the public mistakes as the only way governments can actually do something, there's lots of, not to be, to reduce this, but there's lots of options on the menu, perhaps, that maybe we don't engage, and what can we do if we don't do that operation?
I actually have almost an equation to propose to the audience. I'd like to know what your reaction is to what Canada can do in terms of dealing with R2P in the future. I mentioned to you that one of my major concerns is the fact that the responsibility to prevent should be regarded as the most critical part of Canada's obligations under R2P. And the fact that there were advance warnings in Rwanda, in Bosnia, should give us some pause as to what that type of prevention should be. And so that first part of the equation I want to talk about is not so much early warning, but early wisdom. What are the types of situations around the world where Canada could be influential, where Canada could work with regional organizations? And that requires a fair deal of information gathering, but more than information gathering and early warning is early wisdom. What are the types of situations that Canada could realistically be involved with? The second part of the equation is then the will, what this session is all about, the will to intervene. Taking that early wisdom and translating it into the will to intervene once we've got that early wisdom. And that requires leadership at the highest levels, but also leadership, in my view, from you in the audience. I notice that most of the audience here are young people, the future leaders of Canada. One of the things that has really impressed me about the Arab League, and I see my friends who are over 50s, you too, it's me also,
in Kosovo.
is that the origins of the Arab League was really started by youth. When you look at what happened in Tunisia, when you look at what happened in Egypt, the ability to use social media and galvanize the youth of those countries was tremendous. And you look at how that translated then into the Al Jazeera, for example, coordinating with the youth to promote real, not propaganda, into those countries, I think is very significant. And I think there should be more studies being done about how you create the will to intervene from the top, but also from the bottom, and that means all of you, okay, in terms of the ability to generate the will to intervene. And finally, the third part of the equation is what I've already talked about, proportionality. One has to think about what Canada realistically can do to make the situation ultimately more stable, better than it is, rather than making it worse. And I think there are some unsung heroes in that respect in Canada. I mean, there are many, I see some in the audience, there are many who have participated, for example, after the genocide in Rwanda, for trying to bring justice through the international criminal tribunals, or prosecuting those who tried to flee to Canada and hide in Canada too. So we should look at what Canada has done and has done well, and then how to take that and promote it to our neighbors, our allies around the world. So that's my equation. Early wisdom, plus will to intervene, plus proportionality. But underlying all that is leadership. Without leadership, and I'm sorry we don't have leadership in Canada right now, we have nothing.
Just to pick up on the Arab Spring, I think the Arab Spring is a tremendous thing, and I think we should all be very encouraged by that. In the 80s, you know, I remember people would say that the Soviet Union was going to stay there for another 200 years and things like this. It collapsed in 9 years. All of that to say that I'm actually quite encouraged by what's happening in China. I think Wen Xiaobo, his influence is growing, and we saw today that policeman Wang has been sentenced to, what was it, 15 years? So I think there's a very good chance that we may get a new majority, at least on the standing committee, that's very much along Wen Xiaobo's rule of law, democracy, that kind of thing. I think I'm the only one in the room that's banned in Russia, so Mr. Putin's Russia, I'm very discouraged, but Mr. Putin isn't going to be there forever, and when somebody, new generation comes along, maybe we'll have, democracy will come back into the democratic fold.
I'll put you on the spot last for Canada to respond. In April of this year, Obama had the Atrocities Prevention Board designated focal point for the prevention of genocide in the White House. I'm just trying to get at what else Canada can do. I mean, you said it, we make dramatic statements. We're not going to intervene everywhere, but how does a middle power like Canada react to these situations in leadership? I mean, you've got the Harper government's got they're articulating their own version of a policy now, post-Libya. We're seeing it emerge. maybe I'll ask you more pointedly, how would you characterize what you see from them, and how would you say, what can Canada do then when faced with this array of atrocity?
I can never answer a question about what can a middle power do without making the observation that Canada is not a middle power.
It's an old trap.
El Salvador is a middle power. Canada is one of the most powerful countries on the planet. That seems to be, Canadians aren't used to thinking in those terms. We are, after all, only 35 million people, but we're 35 million people with a $49,000 per capita income. And you get a lot more usable power out of that than you do by having 600,000 subsistence farmers who don't know whether they're going to be able to eat next week. So we have the capacity to do things. We've done it diplomatically in the past, and we've done it militarily in the past. So let's try to imagine ourselves as we actually are, which is actually capable of doing a lot. So that's one thing. The second thing is on diplomacy. I think you saw a fly past on Parliament Hill of the military after Libya. You didn't hear much about diplomacy, and I think that's part of what perhaps we're going to be getting our diplomacy from the British now.
Some of the diplomats were the planes on the fly.
But to answer the question, what can Canada do? I think we can do. For one thing, we can keep the issue on the NATO agenda. For another thing, we can be mentally prepared to take a decision to intervene if NATO ever decides to intervene. My BlackBerry is ringing off the hook here, as it were. We can work with the second-tier countries of the G20. And there, I'm thinking of Korea. Maybe you would include Japan in that, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, others, Australia, to keep these kinds of issues on the table, to bring them to the fore, to try to bring some security dimension diplomatically to the G20. The G20 is going to die of boredom one of these days, because all they talk about is the kind of things that even finance ministers get cross-eyed talking about, and yet they go on doing it. I think we should try. We could lead. We could have led in Toronto, but we could lead in trying to get this kind of opening up the G20 to have a kind of security dimension. I think we could. It's pity, isn't it? Must I do this? I think so. Had we won the UN election, the Security Council election, we would have been on the council for the last 2 years, in which the Palestinian and the Israeli issue, about which we care so much, was centrally discussed. Libya, Syria, Iran. There's a place where we could have exercised some leadership, and the idea that you can't lead unless you're a P5 is not true. We showed that. That's where the responsibility to protect came from. That's where the International Criminal Court came from. That's where protecting civilians in armed conflict came from. That's where the forcing the world to face what it had done on Rwanda came from. Those are all part of our agenda in the year 2000 and 1999-2000. So there are plenty of things that we can do, but we have to believe in our capacity to do things, and that seems to have somehow be lacking. Where if you can't shoot it, it doesn't seem to be part of your arsenal.
But Paul, I'll just double down on you, and then if you have a question, just line up at the microphone. And I know maybe Frank will start us off, but real quick on that, just a little more pointed on how would you characterize then the current government's use of this? Some have suggested that the current government is moving away from UN missions, even though getting UN legitimacy for a mission is absolutely crucial. But it's a more NATO, a world where missions will be NATO-led, like Libya, and therefore that will change how they decide what to do. What missions are useful? What is the interest, the national interest of those? Do you see a shift away how this government is using its intervention and its policy, and therefore what the implications for R2P/UN?
Yeah, I do, but I would observe that that shift had begun to take place already. There is a perspective which is probably correct, that the UN is involved in much more dangerous missions than it ever was before. These are combat missions. This is not peacekeeping in the normal sense of it. And combat missions take people who know how to do combat, and it's not just a coalition that sort of shows up of ill-trained and under-equipped people in some African country, and you have a mission. Now you're talking about fighting. The UN becomes just one more combatant. So there's been a natural evolution towards this kind of thing. I think the government is actually embracing that because I think it's sort of up their alley. It's real men don't do peacekeeping. But at the same, but that's what is going on in the world at the same time. And what I would like to see is that we just had a more robust diplomacy, and that we did back it up with military. Let's not shrink from that. You need to be able to back up diplomacy and these kinds of things with military force, because otherwise you're just talking through your hat. If you're full of moral outrage, but you're not prepared to put yourself on the line, then frankly you're not going to accomplish very much.
Frank.
Okay, just I've had my turn, so I'm going to be very brief so other people can get up to the mic here. The two words we haven't heard that were central at the United Nations when we met with the missions from about 20 countries in New York a few months ago were regime change. And we heard from the South Africans, we heard from many other missions that what they signed up for on Libya was protection of civilians, but not regime change, which is even worse than what Ambassador Heinbecker said earlier, because the very notion that you could protect civilians and still leave Gaddafi in power and not change the regime is interesting. But that was not, it's true, that was not, together with the no-fly zone, it wasn't, regime change was not in the resolution so far as I recall. And so they took advantage of that. On the other side, though, I think the letter from Brazil, talking about responsibility while protecting, etc., is almost like a placebo in some ways. And what I saw happening, and I may be wrong, of course, is the knee-jerk anti-colonialist reaction that South Africa and other countries could mobilize by calling in their old IOUs from countries who had been the victims of colonialism earlier, to make the point that they stood together and they didn't want anybody to believe that regime change in Libya, in fact, would justify regime change as a generalization, generically. And the key is, with R2P, and I think that you've all brought this out very well, is every case is different. R2P is not a one-size-fits-all doctrine. Every case has to be looked at on its merits and in the framework that exists at the time, contextually. And we're always going to be deciding, case by case, whether or not we should intervene through various means. I think, Ambassador Heinbecker, if you'll forgive me for saying it this way, you actually made my case when I said it's not simple. I did not mean military, exclusively militarily. I meant exactly what you described when you did your tour of the horizon and pointed out all the diplomatic problems and domestic considerations. But it will all be based on national interest and the politicians' notion of what is in their interest. And I think everybody on the panel made that case well. Thank you.
All right, go ahead, sir.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Norm King. I'd just like to make a brief statement first. I'm going to put Paul Dewar on the spot here because I just want to make everyone aware that in 2010, I was very fortunate that Paul took an idea of mine and made it happen, and that is that he got a resolution passed to the House of Commons declaring April 23rd the National Day for Remembrance and Action for Victims of Atrocities. And I just want to acknowledge that and make everyone aware of that date for next April and future Aprils, and to have them all tell everybody about it because I'm trying to get people to know about this date and the importance of it. Having said that, Evan, you mentioned a menu of options for dealing with ways of intervening, and I wanted to ask the panel what they thought of economic sanctions, as whether they are effective as a means of intervening in this type of situation.
Thanks.
David, thank you very much for bringing our attention to that point about the victims of atrocities too. Sanctions can be effective, but they are not supposed to hit the people at the bottom of this mile of the scale. They're supposed to hit the people at the top, and that seems to be the problem. Iran's perhaps a good example of what I'm getting at.
Anyone else on the efficacy of economic sanctions, how they work? Iran's actually the case in that area.
Can I just address Frank's thing about regime change too? I think that this is one area where we should take on the Brazils, the Indias, and the Chinas, and the Russias. And again, the regional organization is going to be critical. When you look at not only the Libyan intervention, but when you look at the Ivory Coast Cote d'Ivoire intervention, it was the regional organizations who knew that they had to be regime change and who fought against the so-called big powers for that. So, and I think that's a role which Canada, one of the key things I think Canada should be doing is working closer with regional organizations all around the world to actually counter the idea that in certain situations, as we saw with Benghazi, if Gaddafi is about to kill hundreds of thousands of people in a town, is it really possible not to have regime change? Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. Going to your answer.
Sorry, Errol, just as a legal scholar though, how do you define the limits then?
The limits
when regime change is used to justify a mission creep, and when it's an excuse to do nothing.
If the mandate by the Security Council says take all means necessary to protect civilians, and as it said in the Libyan Security Council resolution, areas populated by civilians, which was directly, I think, focused on Benghazi, then absolutely they have the right to stop the man going and killing hundreds of thousands of people in a city. But going to your question on economic sanctions, it has to be tailored. If it isn't tailored, as we saw with Iraq at the time when there were sanctions against Iraq, there were children who were dying of starvation. So you absolutely have to focus the attention on the very top. And I think much more can be done on that, because many of these leaders who are responsible for some of the atrocities around the world have bank accounts in Switzerland, they have properties in London. If any of you go to London, you're probably staying in one of them. So this is the problem that we have, that a lot of these sanctions actually are not targeted enough to find out who to focus it on.
Paul wants to, Paul, and then let me go to the next question, sir. I know you probably have a lot of questions.
No, thank you very much. I just want to add that even though he's not here, I'd also like to acknowledge that Senator Dallaire got that motion passed in the Senate as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Paul wants to jump in, and then the next question.
Yeah, the business of regime change, I think, is a red herring. I don't think it has anything to do with anything. If Gaddafi is giving orders that are resulting in people dying, why should he be? Why should he have immunity? You know, he ought to be the. In fact, you could make a very good argument that he should be the principal target. I don't think NATO actually did that, but that wouldn't have troubled me very much. So.
Go ahead.
All right. Hello, my name is Andrea Westphal-Lucier, and I'm a fourth-year student here at the University of Ottawa.
Can you just speak up? Can you hear?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Andrea. I'm a fourth-year student at the University of Ottawa, and I just have two questions for the panel as well as the audience. My first one is how to rectify the issue of moral imperative competing with national interest in decision-making. And the second would be how to address the insufficient attention to prevention and development.
That's going to take a long time.
Sorry about that.
You've been given an essay like that?
Those are two great questions. This was the first question. These are excellent questions. Who wants to start? Errol will start.
The second part of my equation, the will to intervene, is all about that creating the moral imperative. And I really, really feel that it's up not just from the very top, but from all you people. I mean, there are some really interesting experiments in that regard going on. In terms of Darfur and Sudan, teaming up with celebrities like Don Cheadle and who's the guy which women love, George Clooney. There are ways to create that moral imperative, and one has to become creative to try and achieve that. So absolutely, but I really want to stress the role lies with you also.
Anyone else want to take? All right. Any counter comment?
I was just going to say that there was a very interesting conference this weekend on the Millennium Development Goals, and taking account of that, and that was actually something that we were discussing about peace and security, was that conflict generally does arise because the needs of people are not met, and so a key factor of prevention is development.
Yeah, can I just quickly address that point too? The responsibility to prevent actually goes to the heart of that, because when you look at all the areas of the world where there's potential for mass atrocities, it's gross inequalities of wealth, massive corruption, and essentially robber baron companies taking resources from the countries and not distributing it to the people. So absolutely, that to me is a critical part of the responsibility to prevent. Absolutely.
It's a great discussion on the efficacy of development, though, and even on the legitimacy of the Millennium Development Goals versus how they're actually fulfilled. And it's a very, very, it's not for this particular day, although it would be foolish of us to think, as the arrows point out, that they're not linked in a very profound way. Unfortunately, we can't take it on fully, but I think it's an excellent point to point it out. David wanted to jump in.
No, I agree. Thank you very much for raising that.
There's another question behind you, I think.
Hi, thank you. I'd like to start off by saying thanks for being here. It's been a really informative morning. My name is Noor. I'm a master's student at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. Don't worry, slightly off topic, but I thought it'd be interesting to get your perspective anyways. Going off Mr. Solomon's point about morality not being essentially the main determinant or the central determinant of foreign policy, how can you explain arguments made about the hypocrisy of Canada pushing responsibility to protect policy and then looking at its current policy on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict when that has also been a mass atrocity against a targeted group of people, not even taking into consideration Israel's violation of their obligations in terms of being an occupying state under international law? And the second part of the question would be, how would you suggest that Canadian policy shift for their policy in that conflict to be more reflective of their adamant belief in the responsibility to protect?
Can I give a cryptic answer to that?
No.
Under this government, all foreign policy is domestic policy.
Actually, I think Paul might agree with me on this too. In fact, all foreign policy is domestic policy for all governments, unfortunately.
I know you're looking for.
I don't think that I'm sorry, but I think that we do have a responsibility to protect Palestinians if we see the same sort of thing happening. Yes, absolutely. And a government should be prepared to see it in that light. The government will take the view that that's not happening and it's not going to happen and it never has happened. But as a matter of principle, if the Palestinians are suffering ethnic cleansing, that's one of the conditions of the responsibility to protect.
Can I have a follow-up question?
Yeah, go ahead. But at your point that there's no consistency in foreign policy, and that, how do you say it politely, that foreign policy contains multitudes, is true. But I think your point is a very good one, which is people look for a kind of consistency. And if the governments don't have consistency, what's the fundamental impact on how we apply rules if there's hypocrisy in one situation? I think it's an excellent question. Go ahead.
Well, the follow-up to Ambassador Heinbecker would be kind of that there have been a lot of scholarly studies and a lot of articles saying that there is a parallel that can be made to these mass atrocities and what's happening in Palestine, particularly the arguments being made that link it to the apartheid state in South Africa and the similarities in what's happening there to what happened in South Africa.
Yeah, but you are now introducing a different issue. We were talking about the responsibility to protect, and if you look at the primary criterion, it talks about. I'm sorry, where anyway, I can't find it for the moment, but it talks about shocks the conscience, military, to be warned there must be serious and irreparable harm occurring, and large-scale loss of lives and a large-scale ethnic cleansing. I think you could, one doesn't usually get into parsing these things, but I think a large-scale loss of life, I haven't seen that in the Israeli-Palestinian question. I mean, if you're going to speak frankly, I haven't seen it yet. I have seen what is described by many as ethnic cleansing, but I haven't seen, I mean, we haven't seen anything like what's going on in Syria. We haven't seen anything like what's going on in Sudan, anything like what's been going on in the Congo. So I think we have to, if we're going to be consistent, which is what I think you're arguing for, then we're going to have to be consistent on that definition as well.
Thank you very much.
And again, it's a troubling line to have to measure what exactly, scale, what qualifies as large scale. And I think David said it, sometimes in the case of Rwanda, it was large scale very quickly. In the case of some places, they're large scale over time, and so it's a very different perception then, and that also has influenced reaction. So I think, again, it adds to the complexity. Go ahead.
Thanks, Evan. Sid Rashid, student here doing a Juris Doctor of Comedy, as well as a master's student at NIPSIA with NUR. My question is about our current government, and I often hear, as I heard today on the panel, that our government is supportive of the popular uprisings that are sweeping the MENA region, and that we support universal human rights and the protection of those rights. However, I think that actions speak louder than words, and so I turn to the actions that have been taken over the last few years, the closing of rights and democracy by our government, our unidimensional, one-dimensional foreign policy towards the Middle East, which is, in my mind, becoming more and more one-dimensional. I look at what I see as the current government's kind of turning its back on the doctrine of R2P, unless, for whatever reason, it seems to serve their interest. And I only need to look back to a week ago with our government closing the embassy in Iran to think that, this is like two kids that don't get along, so one agrees they're going to go to the room and stop talking, and I don't know how that's a solution. So my question is, outside of waiting for the next election, what do we need to do to get human rights, the universal protection of human rights, back on the table, and turn R2P back into a key foreign policy doctrine for our government? Thanks.
Just before I get the panel on that, let me ask you back a question. At the time of the Libya crisis, did you have the same feelings about the government? Would you have asked this question when we took the lead on the Libya crisis? Just out of interest, I'm just trying to distinguish what level do you want the government to respond on? Because that's kind of what our...
Absolutely.
So during that, what would you have said about the government's policy?
Great question. I mean, that doesn't, the 4 points that I mentioned, the closing the embassy, maybe that happened afterwards, closing rights and democracy, I can't think of a worse time to do that. You're closing a center which is focused on human rights and democracy worldwide, and you have, a huge region of the world where, has often been considered immune to democracy, has these popular uprisings looking for democracy. You close, so those are kind of on the side, and I don't think those have changed, but they did use R2P then because, as a member of NATO wanted to intervene. They were heavily involved in the process, and I think, in that case, they went along with NATO. But I never heard Canadian voices, as we're, known to be, those voices there for like diplomacy, mediation, preventative diplomacy, peace. I feel like we were followers and not leaders there, and I don't see us leading now or then.
Interesting. There's lots of views on that, I would say, in that particular crisis, which has been... Anyone else want to jump in on that?
Just like to speak on the Iran issue. I think you probably noticed that 72% of Canadians last week in a poll from basically all parties supported closing Iran's embassy. I'm actually co-chair of a group called Canadian Friends of Democratic Iran, and I can tell you I've spoken to many, many Canadians of origin in Iran who told stories about what the embassy's done to them here, what it's done to their families back there, how it's used their presence here to threaten their families in Iran. I agree with you, we should keep our embassies open, but when you have government's as bad as Ahmadinejad's government, as I said in my talk. And to me, it's in the North Korea category, and I think that Canadians overwhelmingly seem to support the idea of closing and wait for a day when Iran has a democratic government.
I take your points, Val. I would just say that what is supported is not always right, right? Just because people support it doesn't mean it's the right choice. But
Paul wants to come back.
Yeah, I'm. Let's see. Hitler came to power. He had a terrible agenda. He was bringing his agenda in. He was about the worst human being we could imagine. Was that a time to close the embassy?
Yeah, it was.
It sure as hell was not a time to close the embassy. Nobody did, and you get nothing out of closing an embassy except a momentary satisfaction, and then you get to, because now we have no eyes and ears on the ground.
Oh, come on, Paul.
We have no eyes and ears on the ground. There is no Canadian embassy there. There is no mature Canadian officials who have accumulated over time and over different issues the capacity to make judgments about what's going on and the capacity to intervene. We don't have that now. And the idea that we should walk away when we don't like governments, I think, is a very ill-advised way to behave. And why aren't you walking away from Russia? Why aren't you walking away from China? They're worse in their own ways. So okay, so let's close the embassy in China because we don't like the Chinese, and let's close the embassy in Russia. And what about I don't know, Sri Lanka? Let's close there. I mean, we could save a lot of money. And we could turn it over to the British. The way the government seems to intend to do.
All right, there's a lot of questions. First of all, great question. You provoked a lot of great Errol, and then just in the spirit of time, I'll keep going to the next question.
What can we do to get that back on the table?
Right.
Evan, I'm only going to say I agree with Paul, but I'm going to answer your question. I think we should try and be more optimistic that in the future things will get better. And one of the things we can't do right now, even with the closure of rights and democracy and all this, is I think civil society working with parliamentarians from all parties, and I know some even from the governmental party, who are concerned about the fact that we're closing down some of these legacy issues of Canada in terms of human security, in terms of even the intense interest we had in the International Criminal Court, in terms of the landmines, for example, which we've abandoned and has now been taken over by Norway. There's a whole bunch of issues which have been abandoned, but it's up to civil society working with parliamentarians who actually see this as a Canadian legacy to start thinking about what can be put in place which will survive whatever government's in place right now. And the one key thing for the responsibility to protect and the will to intervene is to do what the United States has done, to create a focal point for the actions which go to the three things I talked about, which is early wisdom, will to intervene, and proportionality. Now, again, the youth in this room can help with that, because there are organizations, there's one based in New York City called Responsibility to Protect, which is looking for youth to help them develop some of these strategies. So create an Ottawa-based, a Canadian-based Responsibility to Protect youth organization, which can then lobby for a focal point to be able to create and focus their attention on some of the issues we discussed in the panel today. So think positive. Ignore, tolerate what's happening now, but think positive and try and build for the future.
We have 5 minutes left of Mr. Heinbecker, and then 10 minutes, 15 minutes for the rest of the panel. So I'm going to urge you, I know we have 4 questions left, so let's try to expedite it. Do you want to just go one after another and we'll see where we go? How about that? Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is Andrew Coleman. And basically, we've been talking here about the responsibility to protect, which is different from a humanitarian intervention in that it requires the responsibility of domestic sovereign and the international community to not only react to mass atrocities, but to prevent them as well. And really today, only one panelist focused on prevention. That was Professor Mendez. At the end, we spoke a little bit about diplomacy. So my question is, are we at this point capable of actually thinking about intervention in terms of prevention as opposed to simply militarily? And I ask this because mass atrocities fires don't start in a vacuum. They need to be fed. Mass atrocities are fed by weapons. They're fed by money. Rwanda, contrary to popular belief, was not just machetes. It was fed by French weapons. And Syria is fed by Russian weapons. And those weapons brokers that work with Syria and Russia also work with Russia and the United States. The rebels, which are also accused, well, the freedom fighters, which are also accused of mass atrocities, are being supported by the Friends of Syria. And I think that there's a huge question here about what are we doing to stop these fires from spreading? What are we doing to stop them before they become atrocities? And can we actually think about that?
Great question about prevention. We'll pick it up for sure.
My name is John Scholler, and I've seen my 30-year career in the Foreign Service pass before my eyes. Today I was ambassador to Egypt and Sudan, to Zaire, Rwanda, Burundi, and at home I ran the sanctions programs for South Africa and Iraq. What I want to make one comment and then have a question. My comment is I find it ironic that we've just closed down in Iran when after Ken Taylor evacuated, as he had to, and I was director for the Middle East, a few months later we submitted a request to Iran for somebody even to visit the country in preparation for returning to be eyes and ears on the stage there, and they turned us down. So the situation is reversed now. My question has to do with a country that I've never had anything to do with, and that is Libya, and the aftermath of the successful intervention. I think some people like Bob Fowler have drawn attention to the transfer of a huge number of weapons to the Sahara and Sahel, leading to what we're seeing in Mali, etc. So there are downstream consequences to intervention.
Excellent questions. Go ahead.
My name is Kate White, and I'm with the United Nations Association in Canada. Thank you very much for an informative panel this morning. Hi. I'm going to do a couple of quick comments. I agree with you and the former speaker that if we don't have everyone at the table, we're not preventing, we're not in dialogue, we can't do anything. It's an imperfect institution, but if we don't have a table to which all are invited, we're not moving forward in the world. The question I have, maybe just to put on your radar, is in terms of what can Canada do. We had a history of convening, of bringing people together in dialogue, and it was a respected role that we played. It has also been diminished, I think, in perhaps real men don't engage in dialogue. But I'd like to suggest to you that I've been asked this question increasingly, which is, should Canada be getting out of the United Nations? And I can't help but think that that question is being fed somewhere. Because again, we survey Canadians regularly. I'll tell you, we've surveyed them quite recently. Not only do they prefer interventions through the UN and not through NATO, in spite of the fact that we've been doing, but the other issue I've been seeing is the European Union too busy looking at its own navel for all sorts of important reasons about its economy. And increasingly, even the Nordics, where increasingly conservative and ideological governments are being in place. Is this an opportunity for a balanced government? I know that's not a word particularly loved by the government of the day, but an opportunity to return to this convening role, to bring people together in the hopes of finding solutions. Thank you.
Last question.
My name is Brian Davis, and my last Foreign Service assignment was as ambassador to Syria, so some of this discussion I find very, very interesting. My first question was related to the R2P. It's largely seen as an idea that's come out of the West, if I can put it that way. And I thought it was interesting that you made the comment before that for the Libyan situation, unusually, you had incredible support from the Arab League and from the GCC and other organizations like that. It seems to me that for R2P to have credibility, to have legs and to be able to succeed in the future, it does have to have that kind of broad-based support. Yet we don't seem to have it for Syria and for some of the other cases that have been mentioned. So my question is, why don't we have that? So that was the first point. The second point was proportionality, and this is really more because I'm not an expert in R2P, and I was wondering how you would assess proportionality. Because if you look at Iraq, although it wasn't an R2P action, there were more deaths after the invasion of Iraq than there were before the invasion. There's a potential for that same situation to happen in Syria. So depending on the level of intervention, and assuming it were a military intervention, how would you assess proportionality to decide whether or not it was something you would really want to get involved in?
All right, there's a last. I'll give Paul a first crack because I know he has to go. So what's your name in the front that I didn't get your name?
I'm sorry, Andrew Coleman.
Okay, Andrew had the first question about prevention, which is an excellent question. Then we had a former ambassador talking about the sort of the downstream implications of intervention and so the unanticipated consequences of that and how do we manage that. Then Kate had a great question about the UN and does Canada's role as a convening role, can it be reestablished? And finally, Brian, another former ambassador, on how do we assess proportionality and why is there no broad-based support for the other? So 4 questions, and I'll start with you, Paul.
Well, prevention is a whole thesis. We have been talking about the military dimension of it mainly, partly because we had talked about Libya and Syria a lot. And in both cases, it became pretty rapidly too late to prevent. And now we're in the remediation phase. And prevention is, generally speaking, you know, someone mentioned in the Millennium Development Guidelines, probably the best thing that can happen to a country to prevent conflict is democracy. One might say education of women also, but certainly democracy. If you look at the number of conflicts in the world have gone down dramatically in the last 30 years. The number of battle deaths have gone down dramatically. Even the lethality of conflicts have gone down dramatically. But interestingly enough, there's a parallel. There's another chart that shows the rise in democracy through those years. And it's not that democracies don't fight, they tend not to fight each other. So the more democracies there are, by sort of mathematical elimination, the fewer conflicts there are likely going to be. But prevention is always important. Think of, for example, what Kofi Annan did not in Syria where he failed, but that was a prevention attempt, but also in Kenya where he succeeded. So these things, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. They're extremely difficult. The Libyan aftermath, one of the things the Security Council did say was that there should be no boots on the ground. When there are no boots on the ground, you're not going to be able to control the arms stores that turn loose. So it was a kind of unintended consequence. But I would argue that when you're facing a situation in which judgment, the judgment you have to make is, do I save the people who are for sure going to be killed tomorrow, or do I not do that in the anticipation that possibly there will be damage later? I think that you have to act. That would be my judgment. Convener, always, yes, I think we can still do that sort of thing, but we have to be regarded a little bit more as an honest broker than we are, and less as a participant. And on the issue of proportionality, and R2P, I think the important thing is not to confuse proportionality and the Socratic principle, not the Hippocratic principle of doing more good than harm. In the first case, do no harm. Proportionality almost always doesn't work. Proportionality is kind of a wishful thinking. Let's do this proportionally. No one wants to kill one more person than they have to, or hurt one more person than they have to. But how do you know that? How do we're talking about military here. We're talking about bombs and guns and everything, and people do get hurt. That's why we don't want wars. So I always find when somebody says this has to be proportional, I'm not so sure I'm not sure how you achieve that. I think it's a well-intended aim, but I'm not sure it's an easily achieved thing.
Paul's got to go. There is one remaining outstanding question of why we don't have broad-based support, so if anyone wants to pick that up. Yeah.
I'm actually going to answer the two ambassadors and my brilliant common law student's answer all together. He's my research assistant, so I have to say. So turning to the issue of prevention and the idea that proportionality is a key aspect. One of the things which we fail to really study are the success stories. And one of the success stories in terms of prevention, and there's someone who is intimately involved in this audience, Carolyn McCaskey, is Burundi. Carolyn, stand up and take a bow. The first Canadian head of the Peace Building Commission of the United Nations, right?
Well, the Commission is the member states.
Of the member states, right? Right. Right, and you know, we have, with leadership like that, we have the ability to actually go in early before things get out of hand, and as a result, that has been a, well, hopefully will stay a success story, Carol, but it has been a major success. She's going like this. It has at least prevented the type of situation that we've seen next door so far. But that had to happen at a much, much earlier stage in terms of all the things that the previous question had asked, in terms of development, in terms of the moral imperative to actually intervene at a much earlier stage. If that doesn't happen, it's almost too late to try and go and intervene at a later stage where the tanks are just outside Benghazi. Keep in mind that, you know, a host of heads of state were lining up to shake the hands of Gaddafi in his tent outside Tripoli. Why was all those issues of corruption, of inequality, of the massive numbers of people in prisons, which apparently was almost Canadian built, why was all those issues not being looked at even before the intervention took place? So yeah, absolutely, prevention is critical, but I think you need to look at it not just before the atrocity could happen, but years, perhaps decades before, as I'm sure, Carolyn, you would agree with that. So in terms of the Syria proportionality issue, I'm not a military strategist, but I'm sure right now, and I think that it is going on in the highest military corridors in the Pentagon and other places, as to what types of outcome would happen if there was a limited no-fly zone imposed on Syria after November the 6th. So that type of strategy, I think, is going on right now and probably will be used after the election is done. In terms of by Kate White, who's the head of the United Nations Association Canada, I think the question she really asked is, why are we ignoring the United Nations right now? You know, if our Prime Minister had the choice of either going to Tim Hortons or going to the General Assembly, and he chose Tim Hortons, we know why that is actually being downsized right now. But I think, again, I mean, the burden rests on Canadians to fight against this idea that the United Nations doesn't matter anymore. We are a global society. I mean, having lived and traveled around the world, the reason why I think this is the best country in the world is because we've become a global society. And if any nation represents the United Nations, it's us, and we have to fight for that. So that's my answer.
David.
Yeah, the UN is in our genes, Canadian genes, and I think we all accept that, and everyone here supports the UN strongly. I was going to give up my time to Carolyn, but she wouldn't use it. John Scholler and I have known each other for about 30 years from Winnipeg, and John, I appreciate your view as that of our guest who's just left, but and I don't think we should close our embassy with China or Russia or probably any other country except Iran and North Korea. And I wish, ladies and gentlemen, I talked to people in many places. I'm thinking of one young woman who told me that when she was 13, she was in Evan prison. This is true, it was a number of years ago. She was taken out with about 10 other young people to an execution place. And you know what they did? They shot everybody else but her. And she traveled back in the truck with the 12 bodies. mean, that's the nature of the regime that was then and is now. And I'm sorry, I guess I'm probably in the small minority on this, but I really think the closing the embassy in Iran for the time being was a good thing.
We've got to use our time. I'll just add one addendum about, and I know the ambassadors here can probably talk about this. Just before the election, I traveled to Iran to report from there, and I was the first journalist in after Zahra Kazemi. We spent a couple of weeks in Iran, and we immediately got summoned by the consul to that very embassy. And his first question was, how the hell did you get into Iran? Because he had no clue how we got our visa. And what's interesting about that is it shows how non-monolithic the society is. We got in because there are people in the government that wanted us to get in because they didn't agree with the government. And the fact that we had an embassy there, and even though our consul, and we talk about the eyes and ears, wasn't necessarily aware of how these work, the point is it allows other elements within the government to use and talk against their own government. And so the embassy in and of itself doesn't legitimize the government. Sometimes it's a tool for conversations against the very government. Their own government was surprised we got in. And that's a very, as you know, Dave, it's a very, very fluid, articulate, complex society that is hardly monolithic. So I would only suggest, I'm not advocating policy because I'm not allowed to advocate anything, but it does reveal how these are instruments that can play lots of different music. On that note, I'll turn it back over to Kyle, but just before I do, could you please give our panelists and one by proxy.
Thank you, everyone. The great thing about not working for CBC and working for a university, I can make controversial statements. And one thing I would require you, there's been a big question that came today that everyone has asked is, what can Canada do? How can we get ahead of the curve? How can we prevent atrocities? I ask you to visit my website, the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies. I helped co-write a book with Senator Dallaire and Dr. Frank Chalk, in which we outlay a bunch of policies for the Canadian government that could actually build the capacity to think about these problems and actually punch above the belt. We also put forward a bunch of recommendations to the US government, and the Obama administration has implemented 3 recommendations similar that were outlined in our report. So governments can change the way they do things. They can modernize their institutions to actually deal with the most serious human rights abuses that our planet knows, which is genocide and crime against humanity. I want to thank the Centre for International Policy Studies here at Ottawa U and the Genocide Prevention Group from Parliament for collaborating with us today. It's a great pleasure to we've gone across the country. We've actually got Vancouver, Calgary, and Toronto to support our work. We have Ottawa now, we're off to Montreal. So if anyone has a contact in the mayor's office, I would love to get your email after this. I want to really thank our speakers, particularly Aaron Mendez, Paul Heinbecker, David Kilgour, and Evan Solomon for coming here today, taking time out of their busy schedule to talk about the response to protect, the will to intervene, and how Canada can actually become a global player for human rights. Thank you.